when I talk about this idea of exceptionalism a couple times in Ghost of the Ozarks, what does that mean in terms of interpreting history in the Ozarks when we talk about exceptionalism or the Ozarks as an exceptional region? What am I talking about in Ghost of the Ozarks? Anybody pick up on that?
Am I unique?
Yeah, if
Has its own history.
right, it's and even it's the idea, and this is really, if you're talking about Ozark studies as an academic field, this is probably the most debated issue, the most crucial issue is this idea of, is the Ozarks an exceptional place or is it not an exceptional place? Is the Ozarks exceptional in that it's unique and that it's unlike every other place and that the story is somehow fundamentally different? Or is the Ozarks different in some ways, but for the most part, is it like other places in the United States? Is it like other rural areas? Is the story different, or is it mostly the same? I mean, there's a fine line between where do you decide, where do you tip over one side or another, and a lot of it just comes down to a person's interpretation. In some ways, that's my argument in Ghost of the Ozarks, is that for the most part, I argue that the Ozarks is not an exceptional place, that the story of the Ozarks, the story of Ozarks history, is in some ways like the story of rural America in general, but that there are slight differences, and there are things, and I can see why reporters would come to the region in 1929, certainly, and maybe even in 2013, and write sensational stories, convinced that they found a place that's unlike any other place, even though when you dig below the surface, it was probably on balance a lot like other places, Right, you have a core of people who never leave,
Right.
and sort of maintain, a certain old feel to the place, and then you have these other people who are kind of coming in and out. Some of them natives who venture off and then come back, and venture off and come back. Others, new people who come into the community, inject a little, maybe new ideas and new life into the community. So, there is that element that it's both. It can be both a dynamic element in the rural Ozarks and a stagnant. It's sort of both. It is. So what's the story about? What's Ghost of the Ozarks about? What's happening there? It's interesting because as I was saying earlier, I spent 3 years or 3 or 4 years, whatever it was, working on this book and doing research and all that kind of stuff. And I write the book, and over the last year I've given a lot of talks about the book, book signings and talks and stuff like that. And a lot of times I'll have people disagree with me, people who are convinced that this was, the guy, that the real Connie Franklin was killed, or that this guy was an imposter, who came back, and that's part of the reason I crafted the book the way I did, because I admit in there that I'm not 100% sure what happened, and I don't think anybody ever could be who looked into that story, just because of the lack of hard evidence that you have. I'm 98% sure I know what happened, but there's that possibility that I have to admit, and that a lot of readers, I think, read it and want to kind of hold on to, because it makes for a much more exciting story if it turns out that this guy was an imposter, and that the real Connie Franklin was killed, or even if the guy who comes back in the 70s, 50, 40-something years later, if he was the real Yeah, I mean, all these things are more exciting than.
You follow through with logic and you say, is it possible? Well, it's possible, but it's not probable.
Yeah, logic always gets in the way of, and that's the trouble with academic historians. We tend to take the fun out of stuff by using reason and sort of dismissing all the implausible scenarios. And you can't completely do that. And there's still a possibility that something remarkable happened and that somehow they pulled off this hoax in a small town, brought in this ringer to act like he was the guy who was really murdered. But it's highly unlikely, as I point out for various reasons in there. It's would be really the odds are against it in a big way. Yeah.
That's pretty impressive.
There's no. I mean, there's gossip in there, but it's gossip from sources that, I mean, it's not stuff I made up.
Right.
And I try to present it as that. This according to so and so. Doesn't mean there's anything to back this up, but according to so. Yeah, and there were so many leads,
Right.
a lot of rabbit holes that I ended up going down, and they just didn't go anywhere. But yeah, all of that came from somewhere in the research.
Did people talk to you because you are a native of the area? Did you find people reticent to talk to you?
That's a good question. Did people talk to me or not talk to me because I'm from the area? Here's the thing, and those of you who are from the rural Ozarks or from small town Ozarks would probably understand this. Okay, as I mentioned, here's St. James. This is the area, actually the area, if you remember from the book, the community where most of this takes place is called Dugan, which is actually right in here. This is Cajun Creek right here. That's the creek where the murder allegedly happens, Cajun Creek. And Dugan is right in here, and that's where this takes place. I'm from up here. So it's about 25 miles or so as the crow flies. It's closer to an hour's drive still today because there's no direct route to get from one place to another. But as far as the people here are concerned, I'm as much an outsider as you would be, Millie. I mean, that's in a lot of ways, this is how the small town of rural Ozarks works. If you're from the next county, or even from 5 communities away, you're not one of us. You're one of them. And the fact that I'm a PhD and that kind of, I went off and got educated, which is right. And that would have even been worse if I had walked in there in overalls and tried, with and tried to act like, hey, I'm just one of you folks. You want to chew on my hay for a while. But I mean, you can imagine how well that would have went over. But the funny thing about it is, and I talk about this, I go a couple times go first person in there, but I don't do that very much in Ghost of the Ozarks. But the community is very much like where I grew up. I mean, really, there's no difference. A little rural community, cattle farms and chicken farms and stuff like that, and a lot of poverty and stuff. And so, I mean, these were basically my people, but then again, they weren't my people. My family wasn't from there. My family name wasn't there, and so there was this kind of weird thing where I'm an insider, but yet an outsider. I'm an insider as someone from the Ozarks, and I know the history and all that kind of stuff. But when it came to talking to people, and I talked to a lot of people, I was still very much an outsider there.
Did you talk like them?
Yeah, you would be surprised how much like a Yankee I sound. when I get down in Arkansas. I'm just making that up, but no, it's right. I mean, I talk the language, and there's and I already. The good thing was I already knew one person in that community, and I had known him for several years before I even started this project, and for something completely unrelated, and he was an older guy who was kind of like the keeper of the community's history. And I already knew him, and he trusted me to a certain extent. I mean, I wouldn't even trust me, completely. And that's probably just, that may be a trait of, the rural Ozarks, just being a little suspicious, of everybody, and so I understood that, always, always arm's length, keep people at arm's length. And so I knew that a lot of that was going on when I was talking to people and trying to get information and stuff. And that's why, from a historical standpoint, you try to rely as much as possible on the written record and not on oral sources. Not that the written record is going to automatically be more accountable and more accurate than oral history sources, but you try to rely on that. That's what historians traditionally do. You use public records and you use newspaper accounts. A lot of Ghost of the Ozarks is based on the voluminous newspaper coverage of the trial and the story before the trial, as you can see when you read that.
There was stuff missing, though, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was stuff missing. Right. Yeah, there are missing records. Yeah, missing. There are some courthouse records that are missing. Yeah, that kind of stuff. So you couldn't completely rely. You couldn't get to the bottom of the story just relying on the written record. You had to a certain extent, you had to talk to people and get kind of community legend. And it's technically, in a case like this, when I talked to people and I interviewed people, it's not really oral history. And from a very technical standpoint, oral history is when you get firsthand information from someone who participated in whatever it was that you're getting information on, that you're researching. And in this case, it's more like folklore, legend, community memory sort of stuff, because there were only a couple of people that I interviewed, a handful of people I interviewed who were alive in 1929, and all of them were children, and they obviously weren't immediately involved in this story. So technically, even when I talked to people, it wasn't what we would consider oral history. Historians have a very strict definition for oral history, and that wasn't it. But it can still be valuable. And as I did in Ghost of the Ozarks, I was able to incorporate some of the community memory and folklore and stuff like that, and do it in a way to let the reader know that this isn't necessarily what happened, but it's what a lot of people think happened, and it's what they passed down through generations happened in this story. Crick Greenway, who was the father of one of the defendants and the father-in-law of another one of the five defendants in the story, and was a key figure. For the most part, the Depression got him, and he, it got practically everybody in this story who had anything, and he ended up, he had a lot of land, several hundred acres of land. He ended up selling his land, sometimes at rock bottom prices, and he ends up moving to Oklahoma late in his life, and actually buys a little farm in Oklahoma. But when he dies a couple years later, he's really not, he's just kind of an average guy. He's got a little bit to leave for his grandkids, but nothing like he would have had 10 years before. And so it's mainly the Depression that gets him. Some people did that. Some people refused to talk about it, or just gave really pat answers that obviously they weren't coming forth with any information. But very few people, just out and out said, I don't want to talk about this, get lost, that kind of thing. And what you find is that in that little community itself, the descendants of the families who were involved, they may not be as willing to talk to you, but everybody else in the county, once you get outside of that community, everybody else in the area loves talking about it. And they've all got these family stories that have been passed down because it doesn't immediately involve their families. And for them, it's more just kind of a fun folklore sort of story. For instance, if your parents or your grandparents lived in Mountain View, the county seat, in 1929, at the time that all this was going on, they may have passed down to you colorful stories about what happened when all the reporters came to town or when the trial was taking place and what was going on in town. And it's a fun story because none of your family was involved in the trial itself. But the closer you get to the descendants of the actual 5 defendants and the victims and stuff like that, the less willing a lot of them are to come forward with information.
Is that right? I would have thought that they would have wanted to either set the record straight or give their side of the story or
Some of them wanted to set the record straight, so to speak, or more common was they wanted to give their side of the story, and that happened, but again. A lot of it was that, people don't necessarily trust an outsider to set the record straight, and I think if you think of it in this way, that the one thing that all the people of that community have inherited, whether depending on what side, it doesn't matter what side of the trial they were on, the defendant's side or the prosecution side. They've all, I think, inherited sort of a mistrust of outsiders that comes from all of that sensational newspaper reporting that was done back in those days. And in the years since, about every 10 years, there would be a story that would appear in like a true crime magazine or in one of the big statewide newspapers, like in the Sunday magazine edition or something. There would be this sensational story that would dredge everything back up and would have a lot of these just obviously untrue statements in it about what had happened in 1929. And all of these people resented that. And so by the time I started poking around in this, the assumption was that I was going to come in and do the same thing. I was going to write some true crime story and sensationalize it. And I was going to take sides, one or the other. And I think a lot of people just assumed that was what was going on. And it's hard to convince somebody that, hey, I'm the one who's objective. Sure you are. Yeah, everybody says that. You're really objective. And so you just, you find out what you can and, rely on the written record mainly and try to write the story as objectively and as you can.
You have your own opinions about these people and what happened and...
Yeah, based on the research that I did. I didn't when I went into this. I tried not to. Tried not to go in thinking, I bet this happened, because I'd never heard of the story before.
That's the best way.
Just go in kind of and just start, gathering empirical data and see where it leads you. That's kind of how you do. Because a lot of what historians do, and this is a perfect example of that, is you're basically just doing detective work. You're just out there getting little bits and pieces and trying to patch it all together and make some sort of sense out of in this case an 80-year-old story, and of course you're all the while you're reading the sense that people made out of it 80 years ago, which and a lot of that may be incorrect. It may be sensationalized. It may be blown out of proportion. And so you're trying to piece through all that and find, these nuggets of fact that you can use, and at the same time not just fall head over heels for all the sensational aspects of the story.
How do you know when to stop researching?
That's Daniel, that may be the best question ever. How do you know when to stop researching? That's a hard thing for a lot of historians to do. As I'm sure, especially when you've got basically an unsolved case, as this one still remains to a certain degree. There are elements of this that are still unsolved, and at some point you just have to move on with your life. You have to do something else. I mean, I could still be on weekends chasing little bitty, shreds of story out there. But I remember probably maybe not in conscious terms, but thinking that very thing. When do I stop this? And it's a hard thing to decide. And that's the way with any time a historian does any kind of project like this, even with when you do like a research paper for a class, your decision is made somewhat easier because you've got a deadline. So, you've got to stop researching because this is due tomorrow morning and I haven't started writing it yet. I remember those days. But if you're just like me out there and, you could potentially let this go on for the rest of your life. At some point you just say, I'm not likely to find anything else that I haven't uncovered. At least it's going to really change this story, that's going to give it a completely different outlook. And you just have to stop and put it out there, and then expect that as soon as the book comes out, something's going to happen. One of the things I hoped happened I tracked down lots of descendants of family members in there, but I was never able to find a descendant of Connie Franklin or Frank Rogers, whoever you want to call that guy. The guy who came back I was never able to find any of his descendants, and I really hope at some point I'll hear from one of them. I hope one of them, stumbles across the book.
Didn't he have, supposedly, he had a wife and a kid.
He had a wife and three.
He went to the state hospital.
Yeah.
To get away from her.
Yeah, it's or.
That's kind of what the book alluded to.
Well, yeah. I don't know for sure that he went to the state hospital to get away from her, but he definitely was in the state hospital under an assumed name.
Right.
And so they were estranged. So he didn't want her to find him.
Right.
But I think he did have he had a severe form of epilepsy, epileptic psychosis, and so that's what landed him in the state hospital. But yeah, he did have at least 3, maybe 4 kids. And I looked, and that's one, going back to Daniel's, where do you stop? I almost didn't stop because I was obsessed with finding descendants, and I just kept running into these roadblocks, and I went down to where that family lived, and I asked people, and I just finally ran out of leads down there, and I just had to quit looking. For all I know, they might have been like so many people in the Depression and went to California or, Detroit or, where people from the poor South went in these days and just completely, because nobody remembered them. This was 80 years ago and I couldn't find anybody who remembered this family or had ever heard of this family.
You got to wonder what was the protocol for a woman with kids. What would have been the normal thing to do?
Right.
Try to marry up and get out, or
Yeah.
go somewhere, marry up, and then change your name, forget your past, do all that.
Yeah,
stuff in order to survive.
Yeah, and I mentioned at the very end, she eventually does marry. his estranged, right after he dies, like a month later, if even that, she marries a guy and then she just disappears. And I don't know, and he does, I don't know. It's still lots of those things.
Did you look on Ancestry?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I found a lot of stuff on there, but yeah. Here's what I haven't done. I haven't followed this up. The book came out before the 1940 census was released on Ancestry.com, and I haven't. I'm guessing the Ancestry probably has that indexed by now. The 1940 census. The last time when it first came out, it wasn't indexed, and so I haven't followed that up. I haven't gone on there and looked.
You can always go to Salt Lake City.
Go to Salt Lake City. Yeah. The Mormons could find these people. Yeah. You can. 80 years and many miles won't get you out of their vision. Yeah, that's. I mean, thank goodness for the Latter-day Saints and their genealogy. Yeah. But I've still got to do that. Yeah. So.
How can you let it go with so many incomplete?
Gotta get back to work.
I've got to do something else. Yeah, and this is part of it too. After a while, you just get sick of something. You just you just realize you consumed my life for 3 or 4 years, and I've got to do something else.
At this time, is your wife on your back as well? Going, you need to do something else.
Yeah, well, here's the thing about that. Spouse is always coming to play. My wife couldn't give a rip about any of this stuff. I mean, she's not a history fan at all.
Really?
Yeah, and so she doesn't really care. So any project I have is irksome to her. It doesn't matter if it's Connie Franklin or anything else. It's so. Yeah, I talked to. I know lots of historians who have their spouses read, proofread their work and stuff like that. That doesn't happen. So we just, which is fine with me. I don't know that I would want to, be stuck with somebody who was that interested in what I do. And I definitely don't have to worry about that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah.
So that's probably just justification on my part. Yeah. Any other? We obviously don't have time for our film. We may try to watch that next week. Any other questions or comments? The thing to remember about, and I will get I'll get a really short reading guide before the final exam, because there'll probably be an ID or something from the book, or maybe a question, a couple questions on the final that have to do with the book. The thing to remember about that, for the purposes of the study of the Ozarks, is how the book interacts with that whole exceptionalism debate, and that, this is a story that seems really exceptional, really sensational on its surface, but it's an example of something, if you dig underneath it, then that rural society of the Ozarks, even in a remote place like that, and it wasn't as terribly remote as people thought. You're talking about 3 or 4 miles from the nearest railroad, and we've already seen how the railroad was that's the thing that kind of brought the modern world. That you dig a little bit beneath the surface, and the place isn't as exceptional, isn't as unusual, isn't as unique as it seems, and you do have those commonalities between the Ozarks and other parts of the country. So that's an important thing to keep in mind about that. And but I hope you, if you haven't finished Ghost of the Ozarks, I hope you finish it. I hope it's at least
That's a good read.
by history book standards, I hope it's at least a somewhat entertaining read.